Hey, Nicholas, I just got your questions on some of what we covered in class this past Wednesday, so I thought I would just record a video response here. And thanks for some really good questions. The first one, the idea of death. I think the main source for that that I would cite for the way I'm reading death and understand Paul to teach about it in Romans is Jewish tradition, especially the interpretation of the law. So I don't think Paul is introducing anything novel here. Instead, he is dealing with a key term of the law itself, um, which I think I mentioned in our class. We find developed, especially at the end of Leviticus and the end of Deuteronomy, where there are lists of curses that fall under the heading of death. So at the end of Deuteronomy, two ways are being laid before you: the way of life and the way of death, the way of blessing and the way of curse. And so the way of death there is unpacked in a whole list of curses that reflect some of the different kind of emphases that I gave in class. Death as manifest through famine, drought, infertility of both land and animals and human beings, estrangement between generations, hostility between neighbors, finally Gentile invasion and exile. Like that's the sort of course that death takes in the history of Israel as prescribed by the law. And that, I think, is where Paul's sort of teaching on death comes from primarily. You do find other Jewish teaching on death that is similar to this in Jewish apocalyptic literature in Paul's day, but also outside of that. So it's important, I think, for us because if we reduce death to what we conventionally mean by that term, at least in English, then we really underrepresent what Paul is talking about and how the power of the gospel has been revealed in the world. So hopefully that helps answer question one. Question two about justice or righteousness. I think you sort of anticipated pretty well what I'm up to. I don't think that the common distinctions, at least in English, semantically between justice and righteousness map on very well to the use of the noun pistis in the Septuagint or in Paul's letters. And so I choose justice, not because it's the most precise necessarily, but because I think that it has the best chance of both correcting for some of the kind of static understanding, forensic understanding of righteousness that is common among many Christians today, and also to help us kind of track with the drama of the gospel as it's rooted in the history of the people of Israel. If we just look to the book of Habakkuk, for example, I think you can see that Habakkuk is not pleading with God simply for himself to have a right status before God. He's pleading for God to act. And so when Paul appeals to Habakkuk as the way that God's justice comes through faith, so that the just by faith will live, I think you can see that for Paul, justice involves transformation of the conditions of human life and non-human life on the ground. And it's a complex term in that sense because those conditions are complex. But I think that is why I favor the translation justice. Every once in a while, I throw righteousness in there because I think there are a few connotations of righteousness in English that are true to Paul's usage. But my preferred term is justice for these reasons. Last question, great one here on the New Perspective on Paul. I think you're right that Romans looks a little bit weaker than Galatians. And I'm glad that you highlight what Jewett writes about with respect to the Jewish community already being itself multi-ethnic. I think that that's part of the reason why at least our current category of ethnicity does not work very well to kind of define what Paul's concern is with works of the law like circumcision. And that's mainly because circumcision was not just performed on people who were born to Jewish parents, but was one of the main institutions whereby Gentile men and their families would be joined to the Jewish community. And so we would need a more kind of expansive understanding of ethnicity as an open reality if we were going to think about works of the law as ethnic markers. In any case, I would say that it's important to remember that, like Romans, Galatians is addressed to non-Jewish people who are considering adopting the institution of circumcision as a kind of symbolic transition for their life together as communities in the region of Galatia. And Paul is vehemently opposed to their doing this. But the key is, I think that he's not arguing against circumcision per se. He's arguing against the way that these non-Jewish people who have embraced the apocalypse of the gospel are considering embracing and using the institution of circumcision and the other institutions of the law that circumcision represents. I don't think Paul is against circumcision, certainly of Jews generally, and not necessarily against the circumcision of all Gentiles. You might remember that he circumcised Timothy, who did seem to have a Jewish family, mother, grandmother that he came from, but he was not circumcised. And Paul in Acts 16, we're told, circumcised Timothy because of how he was going to be moving among Jews and apparently not seeing it as necessary to cause offense in that way. Anyway, so I think that we have to sort of pay attention to the particulars of Paul's concern in Galatians rather than turning it into a sort of overly generalized policy. And when Paul talks about Judaism in Galatians, I think the best place to go for what he means is not sort of like a general practice of life among Jews, but instead something more akin to where that phrase is coined, at least in extant writings in Second Maccabees. And it is a rather militant sort of ideology that grew among some Jews, not necessarily all Jews, and involved civil war of some Jews against others, where circumcision was being used as a kind of weapon of submission. So Paul was zealous not just in sort of Jewish practices in general, but in a certain strain of Jewish practice that was pretty intense. And I think the reason he introduces that in the beginning of Galatians is to sort of rhetorically show his audience, listen, if becoming Jews were an important dimension of the gospel that I supposedly left out, I'm not the person that would leave it out, because I excelled more in Judaism than all of my peers. So it's a way of reassuring the audience that the gospel that he entrusted to them, that did not require them to be circumcised, is the whole and the true gospel, not something that was missing some important parts that Paul didn't want to offend them with, or something like that, and that now they have to add to what he taught them. So that's kind of how I would make sense of that. But again, I think that thinking of Paul as arguing against Jewish ethnocentrism in Galatians even, to me, does not quite line up with the audience that he's addressing, or the fact that the markers that he is discouraging because of the way that they're going to use them were open to Gentile people as far as Jews were concerned. And so that it's the particular uses of the law that Paul is especially concerned with in Galatians, elsewhere. And I think that is not often borne in mind by New Perspective scholars, who rush too quickly to the presumption that Paul is having to criticize Jewish ethnocentrism, which is supposed to be replaced by Christian universalism or something like that. This is where we'll read some articles on this. The Paul Within Judaism School, I think, offers some helpful correctives and reminds us of all kinds of ways in which Paul is teaching Gentile people to embrace various Jewish commitments. Obviously, to embrace the Jewish Messiah, the God of the Jews. He teaches them that they're called to fulfill the law of the Jews, although in a particular way. He does that in both Galatians 5 as well as in Romans 13. So in two letters where he has so many apparently negative things to say about Jewish law, he's teaching the non-Jewish readers that they're called to fulfill the law that Jews have practiced. So anyway, those are just some thoughts on how to think about Paul's teaching in Romans in relation to Galatians. And for me, keeping in mind that these letters are addressed to non-Jewish audiences who don't necessarily represent Jewish problems, but are tempted to use Jewish institutions as themselves now new members of the community of the people of the God of Israel, to use those Jewish institutions in a way that is unfaithful to the gospel as God has revealed it in Jesus and through Paul as apostle. Hope this helps, Nicholas. Thanks again for some great questions.